Good evening and welcome back. We're now in Chapter 6, Section 3. The title of this note is Jefferson Alters the Nation's Course. And this is from the textbook, The Americans, Chapter 6, Launching a New Republic. It's very important to understand the background before we get started. The way the presidency was originally set up, the Electoral College voted and they cast one ballot. They cast two ballots. And the one person with the most ballots was the president, and the one with the second most ballots was the vice president. And this is going to end up causing a controversy, and it's going to change the entire way we do things. But anyway, Jefferson won the presidential election of 1800, but not without a very bitter campaign. Many of you live in states, I know here in Alabama we have our share of them, and most states do as well, where senatorial, presidential, legislative races become very bitter and dirty at times even. Wild charges can be hurled from one to the other. In the case of the election of 1800, this was the case with Jefferson and Adams. Got very dirty. The fact these men wouldn't speak to each other for a long time. Now, eventually they would become very good friends again through correspondence toward the end of their lives. It was a bitter campaign, and wild charges were hurled. Adams had only served one term. Jefferson, mainly based upon the fact that most Americans thought Adams was weak because he supported diplomacy over action, and they thought he was too pro-British, Jefferson defeated Adams. But however, since every elector cast two ballots, Jefferson and the person who was running with him on his side, the other Democratic Republican, Aaron Burr, they tied. Someone forgot to cast a stray vote for Adams, and as a result of that, they're tied up, and it goes to the House of Representatives. It took 35 different votes before finally Alexander Hamilton convinced the Federalists to jump on the side with Jefferson, which was kind of tricky because Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. This would create a tremendous amount of bitterness between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. As most of you know, it would eventually cost Hamilton his life in a duel. Okay. And the 12th Amendment of the Constitution was passed, which basically said that electors will now cast separate ballots for president and vice president. Jefferson decided he wanted to simplify the presidency, and he replaced some Federalists with Democratic Republicans. He reduced the size of the armed forces. He cut social expenses of the government, eliminated internal taxes between states, and he severely reduced the influence of the Bank of the United States. He favored free trade over government-controlled trade and tariffs. And this would be very important because as a result of this, many of those banks would begin to fail because you didn't have a government backing or government help in creating this. Jefferson was very much a populist, and that's someone who is the man of the people, and even though sometimes that was to a flaw. And you also need to remember that Jefferson came into office pushing for a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Now, in a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, you're going to find out that Jefferson greatly expands the power of the national government, especially that of the presidency. This would usher in a period of the Southern dominance of politics. Jefferson was from Virginia, as was Washington, and eventually you're going to have several Virginian presidents. He was the first to take office in the new capital, or to take the oath of office. Adams was the first to live in Washington, D.C., but Jefferson was the first to begin his term in Washington. The South dominated politics, and the Northern and Federalist influence declined. As a matter of fact, after this election, there would never be another Federalist president, even though there were many Federalists on the Supreme Court and would stay there. John Marshall, a distant cousin of Jefferson, was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for more than 30 years. John Adams had pushed through the Judiciary Act of 1801, which added 16 federal judges. This is not the same as the earlier Judicial Act of 1793 that we talked about. He appointed the midnight judges on his last day as president, and Jefferson said, hey, if we don't deliver these appointments, then they're not good. Supreme Court ruled in Marbury versus Madison that Marbury had a right to have his papers delivered. However, the Judiciary Act the Judiciary Act passed by Adams of 1801 was not constitutional. And this created the idea of judicial review, which basically said the Supreme Court can determine what is and isn't constitutional. Now, this is on every standardized social studies test. What was the first Supreme Court case of judicial review? And the answer is always Marbury versus Madison. So when you have government as a 12th grader, please give your history teacher credit when she says what was the first case of judicial review, or he says, and the correct answer is Marbury versus Madison. Before then, there were laws that weren't constitutional, but there was nobody to challenge them. The United States began to expand west. If you remember, the Northwest Ordinance had given us guidelines on how to do this. From 1800 to 1810, population of the Ohio territories grew from 45,000 to 231,000 people. Most settlers used the Cumberland Gap to reach Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. In 1775, Daniel Boone had led the clearing of the Wilderness Road. So it was there for the new country. Well, Thomas Jefferson, first of all, had been pro-France, but he began to waver in his trust of the French. And he offered to buy New Orleans, if I'm not mistaken, for $5 million. I could be wrong. Because he knew the French would close the port to U.S. shipping. Napoleon, however, looked at the situation. He had lost what would later become Haiti in a slave revolt. He did not really need the Louisiana territory and probably didn't have the forces to hold it. They had never retaken it officially from the Spanish, even though they owned it now. Spanish troops were still there. So Jefferson agreed to sell Napoleon surprised Jefferson by agreeing not just to buy or to sell the U.S. New Orleans, but for $10 million the entire Louisiana territory. Now, the Louisiana territory was much bigger than the state of Louisiana is today. This purchase would double the size of the U.S. But again, Jefferson believed in the strict following the Constitution, constructionism, and it didn't give the president any power to do it. But he did it using the doctrine of implied powers, or the necessary and proper clause. He appointed Lewis and Clark to lead what would later be called the Corps of Discovery to explore this new territory, and while there, find a route to the Pacific. There was a rumor that there was a Northwest Passage, that you could get to the Pacific Ocean from the Mississippi River. He wanted to gather information about all the native people who lived there and the plants and animals. A Native American woman by the name of Sacagawea, or most people now say Sacagawea, served as an interpreter and a guide. If you look at the map, you can see how big the actual Louisiana Purchase was for $10 million. That was amazing. Even in that amount of currency back then, that was still a steal. It included parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Wyoming, Texas, New Mexico, and Montana. And an argument could be made for parts of the Oregon country. But here's the other issue. To make it to the Pacific, you're going to have go through some territory that is disputed between the U.S., Great Britain, and Russia. This is some of the notes from Jefferson to Lewis and Clark on the purpose of their journey. Now you see, this had to be kept confidential because the Spanish, let me go back a slide if I can. The Spanish controlled all of this territory, and they claimed a good part of this. And they viewed American surveying this land as pretty much a hostile act or an attempt to take it over. As a matter of fact, some Spanish scouting parties were sent looking for Lewis and Clark once they found out what they were doing. Here's a map of what's called the Journey of Exploration, or the Corps of Discovery. They started in St. Louis, Missouri, went up the Missouri River as far as they could go, uh, and then headed this direction here. They could have actually made some other marks, but there weren't any accurate maps at the time. And eventually they made it out the Pacific. I'm thinking it was about right here is where they sent stuff back to Washington, D.C., and that proved they were still alive because most people thought they had died. The expedition's main goal was to find an all-water route across the continent. Even though the water route was never found, it had a major impact on the future course of U.S. history. The geographic information returned showed the great potential of the continent and set the stage for increased exploration, trade, settlement, and later annexation. Here is the advertisement placed to get the young men to go on the trip. And that concludes Section 3 with the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition. We'll pick up Section 4 on Wednesday and Thursday, and I look forward to seeing you guys again.